Yeah, it's really best to think of Samson as another version of Hercules. The Mediterranean world had a collection of these demigod strongmen. You see this with Hercules and again with Samson. You also see this in the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's really sort of the same story, and they may actually share a common origin. But in most of these stories, such as Samson and Hercules, they're both connected with the sun. They're both sort of like solar demigods. And yes, Samson is a demigod in his origin story. An angel comes down and impregnates his mother, so he actually is semi-divine. And he's based on a sun god, the sun god Shamash, which comes from the same city that Samson is said to come from. And actually, the spelling of the name is basically the same. The consonants SMS. In the Hebrew language, they don't really have vowels, it's just consonants. And so Samson and Shamash they're the same thing. And what happened was, as the Jews were drifting toward monotheism, they couldn't keep all of their old gods, so they would take some of their different gods, like Shamash, and they would rewrite their stories with a person playing the role instead of a god. And all of their miracles would kind of be toned down a little bit. And so whenever Shamash would punish their enemies by causing a drought and scorching their crops, you see the same thing happen with Samson. This time, since he is now a person instead of a god, he ties torches to the tails of foxes and releases them into the fields, and it burns all of the crops. It's a historicized version of a solar myth. So that's one of them. You have another one where the god Shamash would rise through the eastern gates in the firmament. According to their cosmology, the world is flat and it's covered by a big glass dome called the firmament. You see this described in Genesis 1 and I believe again in Genesis 7, the Noah's flood story. And so the sun would rise up through these gates in the eastern sky. The gates would open up and the sun would come through and get into our atmosphere and then fly over the world and then go through a gate in the western sky. And then it would drop down below the horizon where you couldn't see it for nightfall. Then it would circle around to the north and go all the way around the world back to the east so that in the morning it could then pop back through that eastern gate. And you see this retold only with Samson instead of Shamash. And it's retold where a group of miscreants try to ambush Samson. And they climb up on top of this gate outside of the city, and they're waiting for Samson to get up in the morning and come through the gate so they can pounce on him. But instead of walking all the way through the gate, Samson picks up the gate and carries it up onto this hilltop to the east of the city and posts the gate up there on this hill. And it doesn't quite make any sense because, why wouldn't the guys just jump down while he's carrying the gate? But the story is about this sun god triumphing over these forces of darkness represented by these people and coming up through this gate in the eastern sky. And this is also a reference to an ancient form of marking time. The way you would keep track of the day of the year and the seasons was to put up these little standing posts, and you would get in this one particular spot and you would watch where the sun would come up in the morning. And depending where it came up, between those posts would tell you, basically the day of the year, what week or what month you were in. And that was a way of keeping track of the passage of time and knowing when you needed to plant your crops and things like that. It was a way to do that before the invention of the smartphone. And the last really big one concerning Samson being a sun god happens at the end of his story with Delilah. Delilah is a moon goddess, and so she comes along and she cuts his hair. His hair represents the rays of the sun, and that's why in some stories his hair is golden. You're not going to see too many Palestinian Jews with blonde hair. And so his 7 locks of hair represent the 7 rays of the sun. They believe the sun had like 7 rays. And so His hair represents the brightness, the daylight. And so she cuts his hair, and that represents the sun basically going out or going into the underworld. He's then blinded, and that's your darkness of night, and then he's thrown into the dungeon. That's the sun going down below the horizon. And he stays there a while. This is while the sun is moving around to the other side of the world. And then during this time, Delilah, the moon goddess, she rules over, his little area. And this is the eternal struggle between the sun and the moon. One rules in the day and the other rules during the night. And each one, they become victorious over the other as each one of them rises. And then Samson, his hair comes back. The rays of the sun, they come back. And he rises up from the underworld. And when he does this, he then defeats Delilah, and he tears down the temple, and he kills all the bad guys. And it sort of recalls the earlier story where he comes up from the gates. They're really the same story. Him rising up in the eastern sky at the break of dawn and defeating all the bad guys. And that's why his hair is important, because it's the rays of the sun. And you see another version of this story, or rather you almost see a version of it. It kind of got toned down and parts of it got deleted with the story of Abraham and Isaac. Isaac is supposed to be a sun god, and Abraham was a moon god, which is why quite often in the stories of Abraham in the book of Genesis, when Abraham is doing something, like when he rescues Lot, he's always doing these things at night, because Abraham is a night god, he's a moon god, and Isaac is a sun god. And so, whenever Abraham takes Isaac up on the mountain to sacrifice him, he's doing that because he is trying to, overcome the power of the sun. And this actually is borrowed from other myths. You see another version of this in Greek mythology. It's basically the same story with these very similar characters doing the same things. And so that's why Samson is very similar to Hercules. He serves the same role. And that's also why his hair is important, because it's the rays of the sun, and since he is a sun god, the rays of the sun represent his strength.